For decades, Ed and Lorraine Warren stood firm in the face of countless horrors, possessions, hauntings, demonic manifestations. But one artifact, hidden deep within the shadows of their own museum, forced them to question everything they believed to be true. What was it about this relic that challenged the spiritual foundation of the world's most renowned paranormal investigators? This story will unearth the chilling truth behind a cursed object so potent that even the Warrens feared its power. The wind howled through the trees lining the quiet suburban streets of Monroe, Connecticut, as dusk fell over the modest two-story home of Ed and Lorraine Warren. It was the kind of evening where silence doesn't bring peace, it brings tension. The orange hue of the setting sun barely penetrated the thick foliage, casting elongated shadows across the lawn and onto the porch, where the couple had shared countless hours of quiet contemplation after long days battling the darkness. Inside, the soft hum of a record player spun an old vinyl, Frank Sinatra's voice echoing gently through the warm, wood-paneled living room. Ed sat hunched over his workbench in his study, cataloging recent additions to their notorious occult museum housed in the basement. Lorraine, ever graceful and composed, was in the kitchen steeping a pot of chamomile tea, her hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from something she couldn't yet name. Then, without warning, the doorbell rang. It was sharp, urgent. One ring, then silence. Ed looked up, puzzled. It was late for visitors. He approached the front door cautiously and opened it. No one stood on the porch, not a car in sight. Just a thick, envelope-sized package resting on the mat, wrapped in brown paper, its corners tattered and soft as though it had passed through many hands. There was no return address, just a single handwritten note attached with a thin black ribbon. "You'll know what to do." Ed brought it inside and laid it on the dining table. Lorraine joined him, her eyes narrowing as she studied the object. "It's humming," she said under her breath. Ed didn't hear it, but he trusted her senses. They removed the wrapping together, revealing a black velvet pouch. Inside was something dense, something that resisted light. A mirror, small, oval, framed in what appeared to be aged obsidian, etched with archaic symbols neither could immediately place. The mirror's surface didn't reflect, it absorbed. Looking into it was like peering into a void. Ed, ever the pragmatist, tried to mask his discomfort, but Lorraine stepped back abruptly. "It's not just haunted," she whispered. "It's aware." They moved quickly, placing the mirror inside a locked display case within the occult museum. Ed scribbled a label for it, intentionally vague. "Mirror, unknown origin, high. Alert." He didn't yet understand the danger, but instinct screamed at him to treat it with the same caution they once reserved for Annabelle. That night, the atmosphere in their home shifted. Lights flickered without explanation. A glass of water shattered by itself on the nightstand. Lorraine awoke screaming from a dream of endless hallways and a figure cloaked in smoke, whispering her name from within the mirror's frame. Downstairs, Ed inspected the museum in the middle of the night, flashlight in hand. The protective sigils on several other objects had been partially burned away. Most alarmingly, the Annabelle doll had moved. It lay slumped against the glass of its sealed case, hand pressed flat against the inside as though trying to escape or warn them. The next morning, Ed made a call to Father Joseph, a local priest who had aided in multiple exorcisms. He arrived by noon and performed a blessing, but even he admitted something was off. The holy water seemed to sizzle as it touched the glass of the mirror, evaporating before it could drip down the surface. Ed and Lorraine sat in their sunroom that evening, silence stretched thin between them. "I've never felt this," Lorraine finally said, her eyes locked on the fading sky. "Felt what?" Ed asked, sipping his now cold coffee. "Hopelessness. As if whatever's in that mirror isn't from hell, it's from somewhere lower." They agreed to begin a full investigation the next day, but as they turned in for the night, the mirror sat in the dark below them, silent but humming just loud enough for the dead to hear. By morning, Lorraine had barely slept. Shadows moved where there was no light source, and whispers followed her every time she passed near the basement stairs. Ed noticed the paleness of her complexion, the way she clutched her rosary as though her very breath depended on it. They decided it was time to confront the artifact. As experienced as they were, the mirror presented something different, something more intelligent, deliberate. This wasn't the chaos of a poltergeist or the cruelty of a demonic possession. This was calculated malice, veiled in silence. They prepared the seance room with their usual precautions: blessed candles, a circle of salt, relics from past exorcisms, and Lorraine's consecrated pendant, a gift from a Carmelite nun who had once survived a demonic attack in Spain. At the center of the circle, they placed the mirror, still sealed in its display case, now reinforced with a second layer of holy bindings. Lorraine sat in her designated chair, breathing rhythmically, eyes closed. Ed remained just outside the circle with a tape recorder and notebook. Their colleague, Father Joseph, stood behind Lorraine, reading prayers in Latin, providing a sacred buffer between her consciousness and whatever lurked within the glass. As is. The session began. Lorraine whispered names no one recognized. Then her voice deepened, her body tensed, and her eyes opened, though she was clearly no longer aware of the room around her. She spoke in a language they would later identify as a corrupted version of Enochian, the supposed language of angels. But these weren't angelic words. They were twisted, snarling syllables that made Father Joseph flinch with every phrase. The air grew frigid. The candle flames bent unnaturally toward the mirror. And then Lorraine screamed, not a scream of pain, but of horror, as though witnessing something incomprehensible. "I see them," she cried. "Endless, forgotten, hollowed. They're not screaming, they're silent. They've accepted it." Ed rushed into the circle, grabbing her shoulders. "Lorraine, come back to me." Her body went limp, her breathing shallow. Father Joseph broke the salt circle and anointed her forehead, whispering psalms until she stirred again. When Lorraine awoke, her face was streaked with tears. "It's not just a prison," she murmured. "It's a reflection of what we fear most, oblivion." Later, Ed played back the tape. Amidst the chanting and Lorraine's outbursts, there was another voice, guttural, male, slow. It only spoke 4 words, but it sent chills down Ed's spine. "Come, join the still." That evening, they heard loud bangs from the basement. Rushing down, they found several objects strewn across the floor. One of the cases containing a crucifix was shattered, and the Annabelle doll had rotated 180 degrees inside her sealed case, now facing the mirror. The phenomena escalated over the next 3 days. Visitors complained of being watched. 2 of their close colleagues experienced hallucinations after spending even brief periods near the mirror. Lorraine began hearing a low drone whenever she approached the museum, a sound Ed couldn't hear. She suggested trying to trace the mirror's history, not through paperwork, but through psychic connection. Against Ed's better judgment, they planned a deeper session. Before they could begin, Lorraine had a dream so vivid that she awoke gasping, sweat-drenched. In the dream, she stood in front of the mirror, but it was larger, towering over her. And in its reflection, she saw not herself, but Ed, lifeless, eyes black, mouth sewn shut. She took it as a warning. "It doesn't want me anymore," she told Ed. "It wants you." This revelation altered their approach entirely. It was no longer just about studying the artifact. It was about surviving it. As the second week began, the Warrens knew they were dealing with something far older than any demon they'd faced. This wasn't from hell. It wasn't from our realm at all. It was the beginning of something much darker. Ed spent the next morning in the deepest part of the museum, surrounded by decades of documentation. He combed through shelves and boxes, searching for anything that could mirror the experience they were having, literally and figuratively. Lorraine had remained upstairs, physically fine, but spiritually drained. Her visions had stopped, but a dark haze clung to her thoughts like fog refusing to lift. Amid yellowed files and faded photographs, Ed found a locked tin box labeled Europe Vatican. Disposals. The key was taped inside the lid. Inside it, wrapped in old lace and brittle paper, was a leather-bound diary, its spine cracked with age, its edges weathered by time and travel. The name on the first page was Father Alaric Benet, ordained. Exorcist, 1864. The entries were dense, written in Latin and French. Ed read slowly, translating as he went, his hands trembling more with each turn of the page. Father Alaric described his assignment to a French monastery, plagued by disappearances and madness. The monks spoke of a miroir de l'oubli, mirror of oblivion, believed to be used by heretics to invoke false resurrection. Father Alaric's writing shifted tone as the weeks passed. The entries became more frantic, detailing his inability to destroy the mirror. He had tried everything: fire, hammers, acid. None of it marred the surface. He even enlisted the help of a Kabbalistic scholar, who theorized that the mirror was not an object, but a veil, a thin place between worlds. In one chilling entry, Alaric described a final ritual, designed to bind the mirror's influence and bury its power. He reported hiding it in a monastery crypt, sealing it with a blessing, and leaving explicit instructions that it should never again be touched. But someone had. Ed closed the diary and held his face in his hands. If this was the same mirror, someone had retrieved it, likely unknowingly, and allowed it to travel, crossing decades and continents until it arrived at their door. The thought sickened him. Someone had broken the seal, and now they had brought that burden into their own home. That night, he shared the diary with Lorraine. She turned pale as he read Father Alaric's description of the faceless ones, the same beings she had seen in her vision, endless, wandering, devoid of sound or soul. Lorraine's eyes brimmed with tears as she realized what the mirror was. "It's not a prison," she whispered. "It's a gate." Realizing the magnitude of the threat, they contacted a trusted ally, Father Thomas Lemaire, a French priest who had once aided them in a possession case in Lyon. Fluent in ancient rituals and familiar with the obscure records of exorcism history, Father Thomas arrived 3 days later, accompanied by a small wooden box and a cross carved from olive wood soaked in holy oil. He listened quietly to Ed and Lorraine's account, then stood silently in front of the mirror for over an hour. When he finally spoke, it was only to say, "It is watching us even now." They agreed to prepare a ritual, not to destroy, but to contain, and if possible, to silence whatever influence the mirror still wielded. Lorraine insisted they not conduct it alone. "I won't risk losing you," she told Ed. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that this could be their last battle. The night chosen for the ritual was significant. All Hallows Eve, a time when the boundary between the spiritual and physical world was said to be weakest. The air was heavy with tension as the group gathered in the museum. Ed, Lorraine, Father Thomas, and Tony Spera. Each had seen darkness, but none had felt it coil around them like this. The mirror was placed at the center of the ritual chamber, now protected by layers of spiritual wards, salt lines, rosaries, prayer scrolls, and ancient symbols drawn in consecrated chalk. Above it hung a crucifix that had once belonged to Saint Maria Goretti, a relic said to ward off despair. Father Thomas led the prayer, invoking every holy name he had in his arsenal. Lorraine, eyes closed, whispered back each phrase with precision, her voice rising and falling with the Latin cadences. Ed stood at her side, holding a silver dagger, blessed in Jerusalem, ready to cut any tie that might form between this world and the next. Then the mirror's surface began to ripple. It didn't crack or glow, it moved, like a calm body of water suddenly disturbed by a breath. A faint whisper rose from its center, not spoken aloud but felt in the chest, as if the mirror were echoing the group's deepest fears back at them. Candles dimmed, the air chilled. The museum's walls began to tremble, not from an earthquake, but from something resonating inside the structure. Every artifact in the room vibrated gently, and one by one, their protective cases began to fog from the inside. Then came the scream, not from anyone present, but from the mirror. A soul-shredding, marrow-freezing cry that seemed to erupt from every direction at once. Lorraine dropped to her knees, clutching her head. Ed shouted for Father Thomas to finish the prayer, but the priest was no longer standing. He had collapsed, eyes open but unmoving, lips still mumbling sacred verses even as he convulsed. Tony reached for him, but was thrown back by an unseen force that left deep scratches across his arms. The mirror began to glow, a deep, unnatural blue. Then it cracked. A jagged line split its center, and from it, a shape began to push outward. Not a person, not a demon, a figure made of absence, its outline defined only by the distortion it caused in the air. "Seal it," Lorraine screamed, crawling toward the mirror with her pendant glowing like fire in her hand. Ed lunged forward, pressing the pendant against the crack. The room exploded in light. When the light faded, Father Thomas was breathing again. The mirror was no longer cracked, it was whole. But now its surface was dull, dead, like glass that had never reflected anything at all. They had succeeded, at least in part. The mirror no longer hummed. The voices had stopped. The temperature returned to normal, but Lorraine wasn't convinced. "We didn't exorcise it," she said. "We only put it back to sleep." They sealed the mirror in a lead-lined box, surrounded it with symbols from every faith they respected, and placed it in the innermost chamber of the museum. No label, no public record, just a whispered warning between the four of them: never open it, never let it see you again. In the days following the ritual, the house was quieter, but not calm. The silence no longer screamed, but it whispered. Lorraine could feel it. Something dormant, but not defeated. The mirror, now locked away in a lead-lined case beneath layers of sacred protections, had ceased its activity, but its memory lingered like smoke after a fire. Ed knew they had not resolved the issue. They had only delayed it. Determined to uncover more about the mirror's true nature, Ed reached out to an old contact, Professor Hakim Malik, a scholar of ancient civilizations and spiritual iconography who had helped the Warrens once during a case involving Babylonian symbols etched into a possessed painting. Malik responded quickly, intrigued by Ed's description and the symbols around the mirror's frame. "I've only seen those once," he said during a transatlantic call, "on a funerary stele found in northern Mesopotamia. They predate Abrahamic, texts by thousands of years." Malik agreed to visit Monroe personally. When he arrived, he brought not only books, but a carefully guarded case containing scrolls from a private archive in Istanbul. The moment he entered the Warren home, he paused and looked toward the basement. "It's here," he said. "Whatever was once dormant in that culture, something still lingers." In the museum, after conducting protective prayers of his own, Malik examined the mirror without touching it. His expression changed. It wasn't fear, more like awe mixed with deep caution. "This," he said slowly, "was never made for human hands." He explained that the symbols on the frame matched those used in rituals designed to channel what the ancients called the in-between. Not heaven, not hell, a realm outside moral order, a space where lost things went, memories, souls, identities. They believed, Malik said, that mirrors were not tools of vanity, but portals, reflections not of what you are, but what you could become if you were truly forgotten. Ed and Lorraine listened in horrified silence as Malik laid out a theory, that the mirror might be one of a set, crafted by an ancient sect whose goal was to capture human essence, not to empower themselves but to sever the soul's tether to all that gave it meaning. The purpose, according to the scrolls, was not resurrection, but erasure. "I believe," Malik concluded, "this mirror is still connected to others like it. Destroying it, or even disturbing it, might create a reaction, like smashing a link in a chain. The rest could pull." The revelation horrified Lorraine. Her visions hadn't been ghosts. They were echoes of souls already lost. People erased, forgotten by history, by family, by God. They debated next steps. Malik suggested sealing the mirror in a spiritual vacuum, a container of sacred elements from multiple religions, neutralizing all influence. He called it a spiritual nullifier, an artifact of his own design, built for containing energy rather than fighting it. Tony and Ed built the container over 3 sleepless nights. Inside it, they embedded blessed wood, cruciform metals, silk, from monk robes and mirrors etched with Hebrew, Latin, and Sanskrit words. When the mirror was transferred, Lorraine collapsed. Not from fear, but from relief. "It's quieter now," she said, "but it's not gone." They locked the container in a hidden chamber of the museum, behind steel, stone, and scripture. No labels, no public acknowledgement. But that night, as Ed reviewed old footage, he noticed something peculiar. In one of the videos, recorded hours after the ritual, the ME. Weeks passed. The museum settled back into its eerie but manageable normalcy. Ed and Lorraine resumed their lectures and private investigations, but both carried a weight they couldn't name. It was as if the encounter with the mirror had aged them, not physically, but in the soul. Lorraine still dreamt of the desert, always the same, endless dunes beneath a black sky, and a mirror, just like theirs, standing in the sand, with something always approaching, never fully visible. Dumb grew quieter. He spent more time with their archives, poring over ancient maps, historical oddities, and unexplained artifacts that might hint at the mirror's siblings. He found patterns, accounts from Turkey, Egypt, and even South America of items that defied explanation. And always, mirrors were involved. One account chilled him. A Jesuit missionary in 1612 wrote about a mirror found in a Peruvian temple that reflected no man, only sin. The mirror was eventually destroyed, or so the records claimed, but 3 priests went mad shortly after. The document described their final words. "We saw ourselves vanish." Ed kept this to himself. Meanwhile, Tony took on more responsibility within the museum. He developed new safety protocols, upgraded security systems, and digitized the Warrens' vast collection of case files. But even Tony, practical and grounded, admitted that the mirror was different. "It's not haunted," he said one night. "It's aware." The house grew colder. Lorraine's health declined. Not rapidly, but noticeably. She became thinner, more fatigued. Doctors found nothing wrong. Ed suspected a spiritual tether remained between her and the mirror. After all, she had touched its essence more directly than anyone else. One evening, while reviewing Father Alaric's diary again, Ed found a page he had overlooked, tucked between 2 brittle entries. It was written in a different hand. It simply said, "The mirror does not trap souls, it empties them." And beneath that, in faint ink, "If you hear the silence, it has already begun." That night, the lights in the house flickered. Not all of them, just the ones near Lorraine's bedroom. Ed rushed in to find her standing by the window, gazing outside. "What are you doing?" he asked, heart racing. She turned slowly. "It's calling to something," she said, "but it's not me anymore." The fear in Ed's chest was cold and immediate. For the first time in decades of facing the supernatural, he didn't feel like a demonologist. He felt like a husband about to lose his wife to something he couldn't name or fight. He called Malik. The scholar returned the next day, visibly anxious. "I've been seeing patterns," he said. "Mirrors being destroyed or hidden. Reports of unusual dreams in the regions they were found. I think they're waking up." The mirror was no longer just an object. It was part of something larger, a web of voids reaching across the world. If that network activated, if enough were disturbed, it might not just trap souls, it could unmake them. They had contained one, but it was never just one. Ed stood before the sealed box in the hidden chamber, his fingers on the cold metal. He whispered, "You're not alone, are you?" No reply, just the soft hum of silence and the knowledge that the war was only beginning. The passing of days brought a deceptive calm to the Warren residence. The mirror, still sealed, still cold, no longer emitted whispers or tremors. Lorraine's health stabilized, and Ed allowed himself the faintest hope that perhaps the worst had passed. But the mirror had not forgotten them. It had only gone quiet, like a predator waiting for its prey to let its guard down. Then, the calls began. 22. Started with a woman from Michigan who had attended a Warren seminar years before. She claimed to have bought an antique mirror at an estate sale and was now plagued by silence, oppressive, unnatural silence that followed her from room to room. Her phone calls were always interrupted by static. Her voice, Ed noted, sounded thinner every time they spoke. Next came a retired priest from Florence who had read an old article Ed wrote in the 1970s. He described a village where people stopped speaking altogether, not by choice, by inability. They stared at mirrors, unmoving. Within days, their reflections began to fade until only the mirror remained, showing nothing but an empty room. Ed couldn't ignore the signs. He pulled out every case file involving reflective surfaces, cross-referencing them with dates, times, and celestial alignments. What he discovered chilled him to his core. Every mirror-linked event coincided with similar astronomical events. Lunar eclipses, solar flares, planetary retrogrades. The mirrors weren't just awakening, they were aligning. He shared the findings with Lorraine and Tony. Malik, who had remained in Monroe, verified the data. It was no longer speculation. Something global was unfolding, and the mirror in their possession was a node, a conduit. One night, Tony was working alone in the museum when he heard a soft knock on the sealed chamber door. He froze. No one was supposed to be in that wing. "Who's there?" he called. Silence. Then the lights flickered. The cameras went offline. Tony slowly opened the viewing panel on the chamber door. Through the slit, he saw the sealed container of the mirror still in place, but its surface, which should have been inert, glowed faintly. Not red or blue, black. A void light that wasn't light at all. He shut the panel and ran upstairs, breath heavy. Lorraine met him at the top, already holding a rosary. "I felt it," she whispered. Something tried to come through. The next day, Malik confirmed that 3 ancient mirrors had been unearthed in archaeological digs across the globe, one in Turkey, one in Guatemala, and another in Egypt. Each had similar properties. They didn't reflect, they absorbed. And in every case, the teams who uncovered them had disappeared without a trace. The network theory was no longer theoretical. The mirrors were part of a system, not built for surveillance, built for harvest. "We're not dealing with possession," Malik said grimly. "We're dealing with extraction, identity, memory, humanity." Ed, never one to shy from a challenge, contacted spiritual leaders from multiple faiths, rabbis, imams, monks, pastors, anyone with experience in ritual protection. They convened in Monroe, gathering under the pretense of interfaith discussion, but all knew the truth. They were preparing for something old and beyond doctrine. That night, a storm unlike any other battered Monroe. Wind howled, trees cracked, and the power went out citywide. But the museum glowed, not from lights, from something within. Lorraine stood at the top of the stairs and saw it with her own eyes. The mirror, pulsing in its sealed container, not fighting back, calling out. The Warrens had seen many things in their long and harrowing career, but nothing had united so many spiritual disciplines, so many cultures in mutual fear. Ed understood now that the mirrors weren't paranormal phenomena. They were existential threats, and they were multiplying. Despite the fear, he and Lorraine knew they couldn't stop. Not now. They had a duty to share what they'd learned, to prepare others, and to document every finding, not for glory, but for survival. With Malik and Tony's help, they organized their archives into categories: reflection-based entities, soul absorption patterns, astral gateways. They weren't just collecting stories anymore. They were building a manual for the next generation. Tony, who had grown from assistant to apprentice, took a more active role in managing containment procedures. His natural skepticism gave way to a sober reverence for the objects they protected. He started developing his own protocols: multi-faith wards, mirror-neutralizing salts, sigils created from hybrid alphabets. Judy, the Warrens' daughter, began attending private training sessions with Lorraine. Though she lacked her mother's psychic sensitivity, she possessed something just as valuable: conviction and a deep sense of purpose. Lorraine taught her how to feel for energy changes, how to read spiritual auras, and how to remain mentally anchored during encounters with supernatural forces. But the most difficult lesson came when Judy asked the question no one else dared voice. "Do you think this thing can win?" Lorraine took a long breath. "I don't think it wants to win. I think it wants to erase the game." That phrase stuck with them all. To the public, the museum remained a curiosity, a room of haunted dolls and cursed trinkets. But beneath its surface, it had become something more, an underground sanctuary of knowledge, guarded by a small circle who understood what was truly at stake. Malik eventually returned to Istanbul, but continued communication through encrypted letters and symbols only the Warrens understood. He had begun searching for the source, an ancient temple rumored to house the original mirror, the Father Glass, as he now called it. Its location was lost to time, but hints appeared in forgotten scripts, buried under layers of myth and mistranslation. Meanwhile, Tony reinforced the mirror's containment with rare earth metals and surrounded it with artifacts known to counter void-based entities. The box had become a fortress, holy, scientific, symbolic. Still, Lorraine dreamed. In her visions, the desert was gone. In its place was a room, endless, white, with no shadows. In that room were people, not moving, not speaking, staring forward, and behind them mirrors, thousands, each one showing a different face, and behind each face, a blank. She knew then that the mirrors didn't just take, they replaced. She woke up gasping, grabbing Ed's arm. "It's not trying to escape," she said. "It's trying to become." Ed held her, silent. They had prepared their whole lives for evil. But this wasn't evil. It was indifference, a force that did not hate them, but simply did not need them. The legacy of Ed and Lorraine Warren was no longer about winning. It happened on the coldest night of the year. Monroe, Connecticut, sat under a sky devoid of stars, blanketed in a darkness that seemed heavier than usual, thicker. The moon was hidden, and even the usual sounds of crickets and wind through the trees had disappeared. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath. At exactly 3:03 a.m., every light in the Warren house and surrounding blocks flickered, then died. No warning, no surge, just silence, total and abrupt. The kind of silence that doesn't just swallow sound, it devours presence. Ed bolted upright in bed. Lorraine was already awake, sitting motionless at the edge of the mattress, her eyes wide open, unblinking. "It's here," she whispered. "Not the mirror. What's behind it?" Tony, who had been sleeping in the guest room, stumbled into the hallway as emergency candles automatically flickered to life. Small, battery-powered devices strategically placed throughout the house. They cast just enough light to reveal movement. Subtle, gliding movement. Downstairs, the museum. They gathered with haste. Ed, Lorraine, Tony, and Judy, armed with relics, crosses, Malik's containment scrolls, and a camera running on its own backup battery. They descended the stairs slowly, each step groaning under their weight, the air growing colder with every inch they dropped beneath the earth. And then they saw it. The sealed chamber was glowing from within. Not the mirror itself, but the very walls. The protective symbols around the container pulsed dimly, as though straining against pressure. The light was not gold nor white, but that sickly, familiar black that shimmered without illuminating anything. Ed moved forward, hand outstretched, but Lorraine stopped him. "No closer. Not unless you want to join them." They watched in horrified awe as shadows began to move within the mirror's surface, even though it was still locked in, its lead case. The glass shouldn't have been visible, yet they could see figures, dozens, pressing their hands against the inside. Their mouths moved, but no sound emerged. Then, in perfect silence, the lead casing cracked. A single line, from top to bottom. As if something inside had pushed back with precision, suddenly every protective artifact in the museum, every case, every seal, every crucifix rattled violently. Holy water evaporated in its vials. Salt lines burst into flames. And then the black light turned white, blinding white. The power returned. Lights burst on. Sirens sounded outside. But inside the museum, everything had stopped. The mirror was no longer cracked. It was gone. The lead case sat empty. They stood frozen, unable to speak. Surveillance footage confirmed it. From 3:03 to 3:16 a.m., the cameras went dark. When they returned, the mirror was simply no longer there. No breaking. No sound, no movement, just absence. Tony checked the vault. Nothing. Malik's fail-safes bypassed. Lorraine sat in the middle of the floor and cried, but her tears weren't of loss. They were of understanding. "It found a host," she said. "It doesn't need to reflect anymore. It walks now." And indeed, outside, somewhere in the town of Monroe, something moved through the streets. No witnesses would come forward, but that night, several residents experienced vivid dreams of being trapped behind glass, of seeing their own faces walking away without them. The Warrens didn't sleep. They met with Malik via encrypted video, and his face turned pale at the news. "This is the convergence," he said. "We feared awakening. We never considered occupation." That night would be known among their inner circle as the night the lights died. But in truth, it was the night something else came alive. Weeks passed. The mirror's disappearance left a void, not just in the museum, but in the hearts of Ed and Lorraine. For the first time, they didn't just feel outmatched. They felt irrelevant. The thing they had locked away for so long had never been imprisoned. It had been studying. Tony ramped up defenses. Lorraine retreated from public appearances. Ed grew more contemplative, spending his days in the study, writing, not books, letters, warnings, instructions, for Judy, for Tony, for those who would come next. They understood that the mirror's departure wasn't an ending, it was the beginning of a new phase, one where the enemy didn't wait behind objects or attached to dolls. It moved freely. It wore faces. It spoke in familiar voices. Lorraine's visions became more abstract. Instead of deserts or blank rooms, she saw reflections in everything. Windows, puddles, car mirrors. Each one showed not her, but someone close to her, and behind them, the dark figure, watching. She began wearing veils, avoiding anything with a reflective surface, even water. She refused to speak about what she saw in the final vision, but Ed knew it had chosen. The Warrens debated one final move, burying the mirror in consecrated earth. But how do you bury absence? It was no longer an object. It was an idea, a force, a contagion of the soul. So they did the only thing left. They passed the torch. Judy took her place at the head of the next generation. With Tony at her side, they began training others, not in fear but in vigilance. They updated the museum's purpose. It wasn't just a house of horrors, it was a fortress of knowledge, a place where stories lived so that others wouldn't repeat them blindly. Malik returned once more, bringing artifacts linked to the mirror's origin, symbols carved into cave walls, pottery from temples long destroyed. Together they created a new kind of map, one not of geography but of spiritual weakness. Thin places, mirrors. Lorraine's health continued to decline. She stopped speaking, but her presence in the house was a shield. Visitors said the air felt different when she was in the room, warmer, clearer, as though something evil knew not to cross her. One morning, Ed found a note in her handwriting on the nightstand. It read, "It didn't break us. That is our victory." And that was the legacy they left behind. Not a perfect victory, not a world free of evil, but a stand. A declaration that darkness would always be met with resistance. That reflection would not equal domination. The mirror was still out there, somewhere, perhaps in the hands of someone unaware, or worse, someone willing. But the Warrens had done their part. Now it was up to the rest of us. This story is unlike any other, a tale of belief tested, of mirrors that don't reflect, and of forces older than memory itself. Now we want to hear from you. What do you think happened to the mirror? Could it truly be walking among us? Share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more unsettling true stories from the Warren case files. And be sure to check out the next recommended video. We promise it will make you see the world differently.